Hey, I'm Tom, a miniature sculptor, and the video I'm going to share with you today is one that I've been dying to do pretty much since I started making videos on YouTube. It's about scale and proportion. Proportion is super important to me, and I'm not just talking about proportion within the figure itself, but I'm talking about the proportion of one figure to another within your own line. There are so many different scales and proportions across a variety of miniatures lines. It can really become hard to decide where you want to place yours, how you want to sculpt your own figures. Do you mimic an existing line? Do you go rogue and just do whatever you think looks good? You know, there are ups and downs to all of it, and I'm going to cover them all here in today's video. And before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I just revamped and relaunched my website. It's now effigiminis.com. It's got all the same great stuff, Havoc Protocol, Goblin Menace, Gnome Guard, all that great stuff. And I went ahead and put together a little freebie that you'll be able to find there too. So stay till the end of the video to find out what that is, and you can go pick that up. The first thing to understand is what really is the difference between scale and proportion. Scale is the size of one object in relation to other objects. Proportion refers to the size of the parts of an object in relation to other parts of the same object. But as you'll see later in this video, it's important to consider the proportion from one figure to another as well, not just the overall height, especially when you're dealing with a variety of different types of characters and creatures. That covers the high level of scale and proportion, but let's break it down a little further. Let's talk a little more about scale. We just established a formal definition earlier, but if you have taken any time to look around the miniatures industry, modeling, other things, you'll probably have noticed that there are a lot of scales and there are a lot of different ways that they're interpreted. There are really three main ones that are going to come into play for miniatures, and I'm going to cover them here and give you my recommendations on how I tend to approach it. The first is your typical model scale, and this is strictly that. It's you take the size of something and scale it down in proportion to whatever the scale is. Some popular sizes, or scales I should say, are 1/32, 1/72, 1/44, but the key here with these is you're literally recreating the object at scale. So if you scale down a figure and the head was a certain size at full size, it needs to be exactly that proportion and size when you scale it down. So if my head is 10 inches tall and I scale it down to 1/100th, that's 0.1 inches, or about a 2.5 millimeter head. It's the same for more fantastic kits like these Gundam models you see here. Everything is scaled down proportionate to what the scale is. Even in the instance here where style definitely comes into play a lot more, it's still scaling down to a specific predetermined size. The next type of scale you may see is for railroad modeling. And I'll admit I'm not super well versed in this, but I have encountered it a bit. And the reason why I wanted to place this separate is because of the unique way it calls out the scales. But with that said, it still uses the same ratio model where something is scaled down exactly. So if something is an inch and you do 1/100th, it's going to be 1/10 of an inch. But you can see here you've got Z scale, N scale, HO, SO, G, and there may be more, I'm not sure. But all of those correspond to a specific scale. If somebody knows the reason why it has these letter terms and you're just supposed to know what scale it is, let me know, because when I was getting into miniatures and modeling, I was super confused and never quite got it. The third and final scale we're going to talk about is the scales used for miniatures. And you might notice something very different right off the bat. Unlike models and trains, it's not a proportional scale where you can take it and apply it to any size object and just scale it down. In miniatures, we go by static sizes for things. In most cases, when you decide on a scale, and I'm using that term loosely, 25 millimeter, 20 millimeter, that's not really a scale, it's a size. You're assuming that that scale you're choosing is the typical size of a human figure, human form, maybe a 6 foot tall man, 5'10" tall. It's usually based around that. And you just sort of make sure that everything works across the line. You know, if you're sculpting a taller figure, shorter figure, you kind of just make sure everything fits along those lines. Although in many cases, you'll actually see that miniatures will kind of even out the sizes. So, for instance, look at this 28 millimeter scale Space Marine. In the lore, that is supposed to be like a 7 foot tall minimum character, but if you put this older figure up against any other human, you'll see that they're essentially about the same height. This image is showing some of the more popular scales that have been used over the years: 6, 10, 15, 25, 28 millimeter, quote unquote, scale. It's really a size, but we're going to call it scale for simplicity's sake. And obviously it's grown past that over the years, where, you know, you've got 30, 32, 35, Mercs was 35, 40 millimeter, and up and up and up. And there is actually a good reason for that, of why the figures are all kind of similarly sized within a scale or size. And as you can see in this image and the other examples I will share with you later, miniatures aren't really concerned with matching scale perfectly. This used to bother me until I started to understand just how important proportion was. And if I may, style comes into play as well. I'm going to make the claim that in the world of miniatures, proportion and style should be considered the same thing. That's because when sculpting a figure, you're trying to achieve a harmonious balance of proportion while trying to adhere to certain fundamentals of making something that will be used on the tabletop. When you mash those factors together, you end up creating a style like happens with any other art form. And that really is one of the trickiest parts, as you'll see, is that not all proportions work well in our tiny world of sculpting miniatures. We're getting ready to dive into a bunch of examples of various miniatures and miniature lines. But before we do that, I wanted to cover 3 things that you really want to consider when choosing your scale, proportion, and style. The first is aesthetic. You have to like the way the miniature looks. Some miniatures have different proportions. Some miniatures don't read well on the table. Make sure you are taking that into consideration and picking something that you like the look of. Next is readability. The miniature needs to stand out visually in the context you're using it. That can be on the tabletop, in a display case. Just take that into consideration of how it's going to be used and viewed. The final consideration is durability. Can you cast it, print it, play with it? You have to take all those things into consideration. These are small little model figurines, and you need to understand how you need to sculpt it and how big things need to be in order for it to survive. Hey, just wanted to let you know you can pick up my ultimate quick start guide to sculpting miniatures by clicking the link down in the description below. It's going to be a great primer and starting point to go over all the major topics that have to do with sculpting miniatures, and helps organize a lot of the videos that I've done over the years. So if you don't have that already, click the link, get the quick start guide, and keep sculpting. Now back to the video. As you can see, we have moved over to my humble workbench where I have assembled a plethora of fine examples of miniature proportions. Now, I selected these miniatures for a very specific reason. Every single one of these is something that I think you and I consider to all reside in the 28 millimeter scale, or the more typical miniature scale that we see in gaming today and have for many, many years. One of the main things I want to point out, though, is when you look at them all together, even though there's going to be a variety of proportions you'll see as we go through them, they all actually look pretty well together, which is something that I'll come back to as we go on in the video. But keep that in mind, because sometimes it's easy to get lost in all the differences and the particularities of size and proportion. But in the end, if something's a little bit different, the miniatures can still work together. I'm going to go through each one at a time, talk about their actual height and head size, as that's one of the key indicators of proportion for a figure. And I'm going to kind of start with the old ones or some of the earlier ones and work up to more modern, but it's going to jump around a bit from time to time as well. All right, let's get started. Out of all these figures, Warhammer Fantasy is the oldest, so let's start there. Start out by showing you this Empire Wizard character. This miniature stands about 28 millimeters tall and its head's about 5.5 millimeters tall, so it's a nice proportion. Comes together. I'm going to pair it up here with one of my favorite figures of all time, the Advanced Hero Quest Henchman. Now, if you look at these, they're meant to go together, and they're pretty much the same height, but as I was measuring them, there is a slight difference, and you might be able to tell. The Henchman is actually 30 millimeters tall with about a 6 millimeter head. Now, he might technically be a little shorter. It's a little hard to tell because of how big the helmet is, but he definitely has a bit of a larger head. Maybe that's partially because this had to be sculpted 6 up for it to be converted into plastic. But all in all, they match up very well together. But if we jump ahead just several years, we have an Empire Handgunner, also from Warhammer. This miniature is solidly 30 millimeters tall, not to the hat or anything, literally to the top of the head. And as you can see here, the head is much bigger. So this figure has a head of 6 millimeters tall. And when you look at them closely and really pay attention, you can really tell the difference in that. There's also some of the other proportions look a little bit bigger and chunkier as well. And it's possible that he is actually physically a little taller than this guy right here. Moving on, we have a hassle-free barbarian. This figure is starting to get into more of a, I don't want to say realistic, but more of a comic book proportion to it. This figure is about 31 millimeters tall, but the head is actually only 5 millimeters. So just a hair smaller than this one, maybe about the same size. But it gives a much more truly heroic look without being too small to actually see the details and recognize them on the tabletop. And lastly, in this little grouping of figures, we have a early Redbox game Barbarian miniature. This is one of my favorite miniatures that Trey ever sculpted. But this guy is very interesting when we talk about size and scale and proportion. So this miniature is about 34 millimeters tall from the feet to the top of the head as posed. Now, if this figure were to be standing up completely straight, he'd actually probably be more like 38 millimeters tall. All of that combined with the head that's only 5 millimeters, that is a very large ratio. What is that? That's at least 7 heads tall, on its way to 8, which again really starts to push that more heroic comic book style as you get a smaller head but with large hands and feet and all these big rippling muscles. As we move on to the sci-fi Games Workshop figures, you're going to see very much the same thing. Here we have an MK6 plastic Space Marine. This is about 20 millimeter tall, hunched over, probably about 30, maybe 32 if it were to stand up all the way, but the head's very large again. It's about 6 millimeters. It's a little hard to tell. This is one of the very first miniatures I ever got. Definitely one of the first Games Workshops. This one specifically, it was my brother's, and he's got it all painted up with these awesome craft paints for me. He doesn't do miniatures, so he let me have all his old stuff, and I've hung on to these. Let's compare this one to this Eldar character, which is very much in the same scale. Once again, we're seeing a little bit of the same dichotomy where things might be a little different, a little off from figure to figure because of the plastic conversion, probably. But all in all, they're very similar. But this Eldar is about 29 millimeters tall. But again, it has a larger head. It's close to 6 millimeters in height. It might be a little bit smaller than that, but kind of closer to that guy down there. Next up, we have this, what is this? Oh, Space Marine Scout. This character is about 30 millimeters tall. Again, a little hunched over, so probably if it were standing up completely straight, would be 32 millimeters. And it has a head that is about 5.5 millimeters. So once again, getting a little taller, bringing the head size down just ever so slightly. It's still very readable, very visible, but it gives that more heroic look. And I want to say this as I'm moving on to these next ones. I'll keep this one over here because we're going to compare them to this. I think it was Games Workshop that coined the term heroic 28 millimeter. And I'm using the term heroic because it's, in my mind, it comes from comic books, but that term, what it's really meant to be is a lot of miniatures that are being sculpted, while they did have some of these more exaggerated styles and proportions, they were still a little bit more true to scale in the grand scheme of things. I don't have any old Rail-Partha or some other figures to show, but you could really be able to see them. Like if I compared any of those to this, they might be about the same height. Actually, I think they're usually a little smaller. But the proportions would have been much finer. You wouldn't have this. See how, I know this guy's got an undershirt on that's pretty big, but the arms are pretty big and thick. Same with the hands. Just the proportions are very chunky, and that's what that tended to mean. That was kind of a marketing way for them to excite and explain why theirs looked different and stood out. All right, on to the next one. We have a Primaris Space Marine converted to just be an awesome power armor trooper for my own uses. This character is about 36 millimeters tall as posed, with a 6 millimeter head, and would probably be closer to this figure if they were standing up, both about 38 millimeters. Now the reason I wanted to point this out, so the head is about 6 millimeter on this one, and about 5.5 on this one. That's kind of splitting hairs, but trying to be a little bit fine. But really, if you put them up next to each other, you can really tell the heads are basically the same. But when they came out with these Primaris, it was really to give that final idea that Space Marines are 7 feet tall. You know, this is an early Space Marine. Maybe they weren't always supposed to be that big back in the beginning, but essentially this guy and this guy are the same height. Makes this guy not nearly as scary. But when you have it modified and have literally change the proportions of everything, you know, this is clearly a little human dude, even though I know he's technically supposed to be a Space Marine. This is a Space Marine. He's way bigger and way more impressive. Now let's pivot over to talk about some Mercs miniatures. These are some of my first Mercs sculpts that I ever did. These are just some demo paint jobs I made for demo games we did a long time ago. Now here, we'll start with the Sniper. This was the very first one, and I'm glad I know what size I made all these armatures, because this guy is such a hunched over pose, it would be hard to determine how tall he really was. But when he is standing up straight, he and all the other Mercs, they are 35 millimeters to the top of their head, bare head, and with 5 millimeter heads. So a true 7 head tall figure with a little bit thinner proportions. It's still very heroic, but it's not. But because the figure is so tall, it doesn't end up resolving as chunky as this one. And you'll see that in both of these figures. Obviously this one, you can tell it stands up a lot straighter, so it is a little taller. but both of these, if they were standing up straight, would be about 35 millimeters tall. It creates a very nice heroic thing. It really helps you, it gives you a lot more room to pack in detail, which I loved to do back in the day, but as I went on, it became too much. I got tired of like having to just put in so much detail all the time and all the figures. And I really, as my style has evolved over the years, I've liked finding a middle ground of having fun, interesting details, but not overdoing it. Mainly because I don't like painting figures like that. I like to get them down and done. All right, we're in the home stretch. I just have 3 more figures to share with you. We're going to start with this zombie side figure, and the reason why I wanted to show you this one is it really is it's probably one of the best examples that I have of something where a figure is really trying to match more realistic life proportions. I mean, just look at this. You know, we'll compare it. So, I'll go over the size first. So this zombie is 34 millimeters tall with a 5 millimeter head. So just about 7 heads tall. And let's compare it here to this Havoc Protocol medic miniature that I sculpted. This figure is also about 34 millimeters tall, but with a 5.5 millimeter head. So the head's a little bit bigger, making it a little bit more of a cartoony, stylistic proportion. But everywhere else on this figure versus this figure, you can see a lot of differences. Look at how thin this arm is. Like that, maybe that wrist is 2 millimeters. The legs, the feet, everything is so tiny and so fine. It's not bad. It's still a great figure. But when you hold them back, you can really see, or put them next to each other, you can really see just the differences. And as you go farther back, you start to lose some of the details. You just can't pick them out as well. And imagine this being 4 feet away from you, that far back or whatever. These figures with the more pronounced proportions really, really read well. And that's something I touched on earlier in the video. We'll get into a little more later. All right, our last figure is this Reaper Miniatures Hyborian Heroine that I sculpted. Now, this figure, and frankly, doing these miniatures, these were my very first human sculpts that I did digitally. Up until this point, everything that I had sculpted digitally was some sort of alternate species or race or whatever. Lots of dwarves, goblins, of course, my gnomes. And so I hadn't figured out and nailed down doing proportions that way. Compound that with the fact that the Reaper figures can be a little large, which these guys are, so let's get into that. So this miniature is 32 millimeters tall as posed. If it were standing up straight, it'd be 36 millimeters tall with a 6 millimeter head. Let me look at this. When I'm holding them, like when they're down here, you're like, okay, maybe they're similar, but you look at them together and with great detail, and you're like, oh my gosh, this figure is absolutely gigantic compared to this one. But I was asked to have these figures be a little bit bigger, a little bit more, they're barbarians, so a little bit more powerful than some existing figures, and that just, meant that they had to get a little larger. Oh, and if anybody's curious, this figure is Reaper code 7117. We just looked at 14 different minis, all of which are considered to essentially be part of the same miniature scale. And amongst all of these, you have a wide variety of proportions and even different sizes going on with each of them. Apart from the actual size difference, the main thing that really starts to separate these and make them stand out from one another is the head size. That directly affects the proportions. But where do you go from here? How do you decide when we're not even talking about different scales, 15 millimeter, 28, we're just talking about kind of 28 millimeter miniatures. How do you decide where to go from there and what size you want to sculpt your own miniatures? Here are some questions you can ask yourself to help make this decision. The first one is, do you want your minis to be used in a specific game? If you need it to match in a specific game, you better make sure your figures line up scale-wise, because that'll throw people off. Is there an existing miniatures line that you really like the look of and you want to emulate that in your own work? Number 3 is really important because a lot of sculptors, I think, don't take the time to think about this, but are your sculpts, how are they going to be used? Are you going to use them for display, or do you want to play with them? That has a great effect on what you can get away with doing. If it's just for display, you can make the figure a little more fragile and delicate. If it's going to be used heavily in a game, you need to take that into consideration and make sure it's robust enough to survive. Number 4 is kind of the same as number 2, but I wanted to give it its own question because it really is important to ask this on its own. What style or proportion is your favorite to sculpt? As we went over when we were looking at all of the examples, I showed you how even though these miniatures have variation, they do still all work together. They can still work together. So there's definitely wiggle room. But you might have a preference for the look, either how you are going about executing the style. Maybe you don't like everything to be so fine. Maybe that's hard for you. Or maybe you just like the look of packing in lots of detail, versus keeping things simpler. So ask yourself, what do you actually like? And don't be afraid to interject that into how you sculpt, even as you're answering these other questions. This is actually something I struggled with for years. I had so much self-doubt because I wanted my figures to work with Games Workshop games, or like Necromunda, Warhammer Fantasy, but I wasn't as attuned to sculpting in that exact style and proportion. I like things to be a little bit more smaller head, but not too small. I still like that bit chunkier proportion, but my background in comic books really informed that. So after sculpting all these goblins and gnomes and other characters that weren't humans, I decided to sit down and really figure out and decide what would the size and scale of my human figures be. And as I was working on these Hyborian miniatures for Reaper, that's when I put together this document that was going to allow me to really work through and figure out what I truly liked and how I wanted to sculpt these characters of my own going forward. What I did is made this scale chart that had a bunch of 25 millimeter bases on it and guide marks going up to 40 millimeters tall. And the idea here was that I would impose, photographs, straight on photographs of different miniatures at their true size, but then leave open areas in place so that I could start sketching and very quickly playing with different sizes and proportions, specifically focusing on the head size and how many heads tall the figure will be. Let me show you how I use this document to figure out the size and proportions of all my miniatures. We'll start with the top row here. Now these figures here are showing you all the way on the right is the original miniature I was given to reference for my barbarians that I made for Reaper. And to the left are the 3 base characters. The first one and the second one on the left are completely standing straight up, and that third one is hunched over, so even though it's saying it's 34 millimeters tall, this character is probably pretty close in height to the man and woman on the left. The body blank for the barbarian heroine is that 37 millimeters tall, 6 millimeter tall head, as we discussed earlier. Male, same thing, 38 millimeters tall, just a little taller, but also with the 6 millimeter tall head. After getting these first human miniatures that I created set up, I wanted to start playing with the proportions. So we'll go to the bottom row here, and I knew that was way bigger. Those barbarians were way bigger than what I wanted to sculpt and make for my human figures going forward, whether it's Havoc Protocol or the humans that will be featured in the Goblin Menace. I'm going to focus on the sizes and proportions of the male figures since that's what I usually base the overall scale on, and it'll be a little quicker to go through everything. So I want to start on the right side. For this one, I simply took the figures above and scaled them down to be 35 millimeters tall. This obviously sized the head down, making it probably a little more like 5.5 millimeters tall. This size gave me a good representation of what this figure's proportions would look like at the scale or size of a Merck's miniatures. I felt pretty certain that 35 millimeters was going to be much larger, even still too large for what I wanted to do going forward. So what I did is I took the figures on the right and I put them on the left, and I scaled down the bodies so that they were at a 32 millimeter height, which is a scale that I've been playing with off and on and have found that I've kind of been enjoying that in other lines. But instead of simply scaling everything down, I took the heads, the 5.5 millimeter heads from the right, and I imposed that over the bodies on the left. This was all around the time I was making my Frog Knight miniatures, so I went ahead and added them to this sheet as well to have for reference. Then I went ahead and added my gnome and goblin blanks just to finish getting a full sense of how all the denizens of the Goblin Menace size up to one another. Next, I started to draw out a bunch of different human proportions, different sizes, different overall sizes, different head sizes. On all the way to the right, you'll see a drawing that I created a long time ago, just a quick sketch when I was first dabbling with this idea. And I felt like maybe that's where I wanted to end up, but I still wanted to do an exploration. So let's go back to the left side. I did a 30 millimeter tall human with that's 6 heads high, went to 32 millimeters. That ended up being about 6.4 heads high. I think those are both with 5 millimeter heads. Then I did one that was 32, but I gave it a bigger head. I've been big into Old Hammer for a while, getting back into that and really studying those figures. So I wanted to explore some of those proportions, but it was a little bit too big and chunky, even though the figures scaled up from those slightly. Next, did another 32 millimeter tall figure. This time it was 5.8 heads tall, so still a little bit on the bigger side, probably 5.5 millimeters. And lastly, I did a 34 millimeter figure. This is 6.2 heads tall, and this is really the template that I ended up using for Havoc Protocol. I really like that size for my sci-fi figures. I feel like it fits a lot of miniature lines that are in that space, but still allows me to work with the right scale and proportions that I think looks good and that I enjoy doing in my own work. Then I went ahead and added in a few of the other denizens that weren't yet represented for Goblin Menace before placing that original drawing that I did of the 32 millimeter tall miniatures with about 5.5 millimeter tall head of humans. Seeing all these different body styles arrayed together really helped me solidify the idea of what I wanted the proportions of my humans to be. And so this is the direction I have decided to go for now. And I say for now because I do still have to do the final step of actually sculpting a human miniature for this line. Once I get into it, and sometimes when you actually make the final physical piece, you catch a few things that don't stand out to you the same way with a drawing or diagram like this. But this is a great way to start to just eliminate certain styles or proportions that you just know aren't going to work or you aren't happy with. I went ahead and put something together to help you put everything we've covered into practice. I call it the Miniature Thumbnail Worksheet, and it's an updated version of what I showed you in this video. A few of the updates include giving a little more space between each of the bases so you have more room to sketch your concepts. I also added a measurement marker so you can goes up tracks every 5 millimeters just to make it a little easier to see what height and scale you're working at. And I removed my predefined 32 millimeter line so that you can draw your own line in at the specific scale or size that you're trying to work with. You can download this for free at my brand new website, effigyminis.com. Head over there or click the link down in the description below. I'm curious to hear what scales and proportions are your favorite. What are some miniature lines that you really love, or the type of size of figures you like to sculpt? Go ahead and let me know down in the comments below. So get out there, decide what scale you're going to make your miniatures, and keep sculpting.